I'm Charlie Clements. I'm the new Executive Director of the Carr-Ryan Center for Human Rights. So let me welcome you today to Is Another Gandhi Possible Today? We're very fortunate to have Professor Ramin Jahanbegloo with us today. He's born in Tehran. He has a doctorate in philosophy from the Sorbonne University in Paris, where he lived for 20 years. He's also a postdoctorate of Middle Eastern Studies here at Harvard University. And there are many things to say about him. I'm going to steal a little bit of his thunder because when he was imprisoned a few years ago in Iran, he said that a number of Harvard faculty signed a letter that helped him to be released, but not before he was in solitary confinement for 4 months. As you have probably read from the poster, his first books were works on the 19th century German philosophers, and who were very much engaged in the issues of both revolution and state power, what he called the philosophies of violence. But in more than the last decade, he's written books about Gandhi, nonviolence, and one of his most interesting, I think, is The Clash of Intolerances. Last month, Ramin accepted the Peace Prize from the United Nations Association in Spain for his body of academic work promoting dialogue amongst cultures and his advocacy for nonviolence. I think that his intellectual achievements are quite remarkable, but his achievements as a human rights activist are quite remarkable as well, so it gives me pleasure to welcome Ramin Jahanbegloo.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back at Harvard. Let me start with a quote from Woody Allen, because he used to say that 80% of success in a lecture is to show up at the lecture. But the remaining 20% is actually to make sure that the people don't look at their watches while you're talking. So here I am, and I wanted to share with you some of my ideas on Gandhi and Islam and nonviolence. And many thanks to, I would like to express my gratitude, my thanks to Brody and Charlie and Stephen and all other people at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy for inviting me here to share with you my views on Islam and nonviolence and human rights. So, as you know, the topic I'm going to talk about today is going to be, is another Gandhi possible, but the second title to it is a Muslim Gandhi possible? I think that this question is actually is not a definite and a final question. It does not have a final answer to it. And I would say that the starting point for a world with less violence is certainly the belief that it is possible to have such a world. So I think that we need to think of nonviolence in another way. We need to think of religion and spirituality in another way. And we need to think of religion as a pillar of human civilization, as it has always been, and somehow a pillar which is there to protect human dignity rather to destroy it. Very, very important. And I do believe that this is why it is very important beyond the list of atrocities that we see with religion or religious people in the past centuries, and especially in 20th century and 21st century. We need to have the ability to distinguish between what is violent and what is not violent. Now, talking about Islam and nonviolence, which is a very hot topic actually, but not a topic that is discussed very often. It happens to me to give lectures even in Kashmir on this subject, and so go to very, I would say, difficult places and start talking with people on this subject. And as you know, and I think the US is the best place to talk about this subject, because in the post-9/11 political climate, the two words mix like water and oil if we talk about Islam and nonviolence. And unfortunately, the image of a fanatical and violent Muslim has become a dominant stereotype since 11 September 2001. And I would say that the changing global tempo around this issue weighs on the relationship between Islam and public sphere. Now, lost in all this stereotype is a long record of Muslim experiences, of nonviolent experience, and peacemaking and change. And I think that history offers much evidence of Muslim tolerance and civil engagement with other faiths and cultural traditions, and certainly nonviolent Islam could give a fresh life to secularism in Muslim societies, and it may help even to steer Muslim public space away from state-dominated as well as other forms of political Islam. So this is actually the points I want to make. It's not just that we go and try to find nonviolent Gandhi Muslims, but also how we can rethink the relationship between the religious and the secular in Muslim societies by thinking nonviolent Islam. So the challenge is to somehow generate an account of the possibility of a Muslim public sphere with its relationship to tension management and violence taming. However, before identifying the empirical experiences of Muslim nonviolence and the pragmatic applicability to Muslim public spheres, I think that we need to distinguish between nonviolence and religious pacifism. I'm not talking here about religious pacifism. Now, one difficulty with religious pacifism as an absolute principle to participate in wars is that, unlike nonviolent strategies, it refuses a political engagement and intervention in the world. As for nonviolence, it can certainly provide a powerful platform from which to make political choices. I think that nonviolence as a specific form of political praxis is singularly distinguishable from what we have in 20th century Western political philosophy, and especially understandings of people like Carl Schmitt's understanding of the political as dominion and mastery, and as you know, the relationship between the friend and the foe. I very recently finished a book for Yale University Press on that issue, and talking about how Gandhi somehow challenges these paradigms of Western political philosophy, and especially the Hobbesian Schmittian one, actually. As you know, let me say just one word about this Schmittian, Hobbesian paradigm. As you know, Schmitt elaborates the concept of the political that can be understood autonomously in terms of the friend and enemy grouping, and however, Schmitt's desire to ground the political in an autonomous field of meaning reduces the political down to a juridical moment, presupposing a decisionist discourse of sovereignty with no ethical underpinnings. Now, what happens to the public sphere? This is the question I'm asking through Gandhi and through the Gandhi and Islam. What happens to the public sphere when the Schmittian friend-enemy, I would say, distinctions are being questioned in the context of what we can call ethicalization, or what Gandhi called the spiritualization of politics, meaning where ethical values such as tolerance and nonviolence are used to discuss political issues. Well, this interrogation can direct us to the relevance of the Gandhian philosophy and to the growing, certainly, divide in many minds between the modern concept of sovereignty founded in the Hobbesian Schmittian idea of absolute power and the state of exception, of course, and the idea which is put forward by the Gandhian philosophy, which is the idea of shared sovereignty as an alternative to a view of power. And this idea of shared sovereignty is what I call, in my book, the Gandhian moment, which could happen practically in many civic movements, nonviolent movements around the world, as it has happened in the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King in America, as it has happened in Poland with the Solidarność, as it has happened in Thailand, as it has happened in Burma, and very recently also in Iran and in other Muslim societies. This Gandhian moment is in Islamic mind, I think it also challenges the prevalent myth of absence and impossibility of nonviolent action in the Muslim public sphere, which is in the mind of many people in the East or in the West. Now, to say a few words about Gandhi. For Gandhi, as you know, it is not the subject that is the consequence of sovereignty, but it is the sovereignty which is subordinated to the political actions of the subject. And that is why the Gandhi moment of politics is an effort to spiritualize, or let's say to ethicalize politics. It's not to bring religion into politics, not at all. On the contrary, is to bring ethics into politics, meaning to bind up every action in the public sphere with ethics. So, and this is because Gandhi believed that at the core of every religion, every individual could find truth, what he called satya. It could find nonviolence, what he called ahimsa, and also the golden rule. And that's why he advocated religious pluralism. And in his view, all religions represented so many different paths to the realization of truth and deserve equal respect. Now, Gandhi argued that a person who believes in truth and God cannot go to the mosque, cannot go to the synagogue, cannot go to a temple, cannot go to a church one day, and the next day foster hatred and violence. These two cannot go together, as we find it today in some countries, like Iran and or the other countries today. Therefore, for Gandhi, the spirituality of nonviolence had to be applied to all facets of life. And he called politics a spiritual and moral activity rather than a religious activity. So the distinction here between ethics and religion, the distinction between spirituality and religion is very important, as much as it was for Tolstoy, as much as it was for other nonviolent figures. And finally, Gandhi presented nonviolence as an integral part of politics. Now, it is interesting to see how Gandhi was able to influence believers of other religions by unlocking, what I would say, the spiritual dynamic in all of them. And he had the good fortune to have as his colleagues people belonging to different religions. The most famous one that you find in the movie of Attenborough is Charlie Andrews, of course, from the Christian side. But the two others, which are not mentioned very often, are of course Maulana Azad and Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. Now, many historians, that's my point, many historians have ignored the fact that Gandhi had a very high esteem for Islam. And he regarded it as a religion of peace, as a religion of love, of kindness, of brotherhood of all men. And he always put Islam at the same level as Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, and Judaism, of course. And he was persuaded that in the Islamic world, as in the Hindu religion and Christianity, there were men and women who, being moral in character, would work nonviolence and peace in the world. And so maybe that is why Gandhi found in these Muslims, like Abdul Ghaffar Khan or Maulana Azad, more than mere fighters for independence. He found some new Gandhis, I would say, and new Muslim Gandhis like himself, or people who can even teach him nonviolence. Well, like Gandhi himself, these Muslim leaders struggled to highlight the resources in their own religious traditions that could build nonviolent social movements while wrestling to reveal and repudiate the forces of violence inherent in those traditions. And as a matter of fact, when we look at the lives and thoughts of some of these Muslim leaders like Abdul Ghaffar Khan and Maulana Azad, who worked with Gandhi to bring India back to independence, we understand the complaint of many in the West since 9/11 that there is no Muslim Gandhi. But we should also find a way to go beyond it and try to find out how these nonviolent figures actually worked out the intellectual and political, I would say, arenas in the Islamic tradition. So my point is that there is no political or moral reason that Islamic societies could not take a lead in developing nonviolence today, And there is every reason that most of them should. That's my point. I'm against those people who certainly believe that because you belong to a faith or to a religion, you cannot be nonviolent. That is absolutely a nonsense from my point of view. I think that in promoting the paradigm of nonviolence in Islam, Muslims can look back to the contemporary examples of leaders like Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and Maulana Azad, who actually through the rejection of violence and revenge and the readiness to cooperate and construct with non-Muslims prepared the path of nonviolence in Islam. For example, Ghaffar Khan started forming his philosophy of nonviolence even before he came into contact with Gandhi, and that's very important. And his nonviolent action drew its inspiration from the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad, as he quotes it all the time, in contrast to Gandhi, who, as you know, is inspired very much by Bhagavad Gita, the New Testament, and the writings of Thoreau, Ruskin, and Tolstoy. Now, so for Ghaffar Khan, Islam is already what he calls a religion of patience, sabr, and mutual toleration. That's exactly his wordings. And he quoted Islam as being selfless service, as being love, as being faith. And that's why his profound belief in the truth and effectiveness of violence, of nonviolence, came from the depths of, I would say, his personal experience of Islam. As for Maulana Azad, who became later on, after the independence of India, the Minister of Education, the real goal of religion was not to divide, but to unite. So for him, religions were different roads converting to the same goal, and that's exactly the Gandhian religious pluralism, or the Gandhian idea of religion that I was talking about. And in fact, Azad, if you know a little bit of Arabic or have you read about Islam, he distinguishes between what we call in Arabic or even in Persian, deen and sharia. According to Azad, sharia may differ from people to people depending on time and places and modes of living in different conditions, but deen, which is the essence of religion or faith, is one among all. So this actually was the distinction he made, and he defined secularism not as a lack of religion and spirituality in the public sphere, but as equal respect for all religions. So you see that actually our paradigm changes even. Our way of looking at ideas like secularism, which are ideas which were brought up in the Middle East or in the Muslim world in the early 20th century, has never been this way. I mean, we always defined secularism as the absence of religion, but not respect for all religions. Therefore, in the mind of Muslim Gandhis, like Ghaffar Khan and Maulana Azad, a secular public sphere meant separation of religion from the political, economic, cultural, and social aspects, but it did not mean necessarily separation from spirituality, you know. So two different things actually, and it meant full freedom and respect, as I said, for all religions, and that's why it's so important. So the life stories of Ghaffar Khan and Maulana Azad prove that nonviolent action could be consistent with Islamic principles. That's one point. And the result of such a process, the results, I would say, are certainly unpredictable, but given the Gandhian view that no one possesses the whole truth and that truth emerges in a dialogical encounter among subjects, the making of a new Muslim Gandhi in the 21st century remains a challenge. So if you come back to me and you ask the question, well, do you have an answer? Is a Muslim Gandhi possible? Yes or no? I would say maybe. There is no definite yes, there is no definite no. It remains as a challenge. But the challenge is in the hands of the Muslims themselves to prepare that. Now, I think that nonviolent Islam could give, and that this is from now on, I'm going to talk more theoretically about these ideas of secularism and civil society in the Muslim societies in regard with nonviolence and nonviolent Islam. I think that nonviolent Islam could give a new turn to secularism in Muslim societies. it could help the Muslim public sphere to be away from organized religion and its dogmatic formulations while being open to the presence of spirituality in the political debates. And we have to understand that the tension between the secular and the religious, which we can call the dialectic of convictions, is primarily not a dialectic of convictions, but a dialectic of citizenship, actually, meaning a creative tension between religious commitments and secular morality, I would say. So the religious-secular relationship has consequences for the democratic capacity of citizenship. And if this is the case, the democratic subjectivation cannot necessarily mean a willing or forced withdrawal from the spiritual in the public space. So it goes without saying that a completely secularized society has no meaning because any secular society inherits values and it inherits dispositions and orientations from a spiritual tradition or a spiritual past. My reference here is, of course, to John Dewey, for example, since we are here in the US, when he discusses the spiritual dimension of democracy. When Dewey uses the term religious, he does not appeal to any sect or religion or any fundamentalist form of religion. He uses the term spiritual to connote a spiritual quality of human experience, which is important actually for democracy. And he touches upon a way of transcending the tension between the religious and the secular by defining democracy as a way to fulfill the spiritual needs of citizens. So this is one aspect which is very important, and I think that at least in principle, what Gandhi used to call, and the Muslim Gandhis used to call, spiritualizing the politics or spiritualizing the public space could play a role in the growth of some sentiments favorable to human rights in general and help to account for the energy of secular humanism. This is one way of doing things and not through absolute secularism. Why do I say that? Because I think that since we are at the Carr Center, I think that securing human rights in the Muslim world could be a great help in combating ideologizations of religion and homogenization of the secular. You know, the combat which today exists in the Muslim world, but especially in the Middle East, is actually because there has been an ideologization of the traditions, or let's say the religious, but also on the other hand, with the experiences of Reza Shah in Iran or Kemal Atatürk in Turkey, we had, or the Ba'ath Party in Iraq and Syria, we had the homogenization of the secular and the exclusion of the spiritual from the public space. So crucial to preserving human rights in the Muslim world is continued awareness of their value and of the value of the democratic order that secures them, and this awareness is too easily forgotten, especially in a situation of tension between the secular and the religious as we see it today in many Muslim societies. However, I do believe that awareness of the value of human rights could be revitalized in the Muslim world through nonviolence and through inclusive political process. And it goes without saying that authoritarian secularism, like the Atatürk's one, and fundamentalist Islam have failed to create a sustainable democratic situation, because both authoritarian secularism and fundamentalist Islam have now run their course in the Muslim world. And they have failed, both have failed, actually. We are already, and this is my point, many other analysts agree with this also, we are already at the phase of post-Islamism in many different countries, and we are already in the phase of post-Islamism in Iran, certainly, which has found expressions in different social practices, in civic movements, in political initiatives, and in theological thoughts. So this post-Islamism should be considered as a continuous process of Islamic experience in terms of secular exigencies, but also as a non-violent, I would say, Islam. And the tremendous transformation in the discourse and action that we see today in Iranian civil society, I would say, since the 1990s, exemplifies this idea and exemplifies this tendency, and the fact that scores of Islamists themselves have turned to human rights, have turned towards the idea of democracy, and many of them also towards the idea of nonviolence, I would say, debate and dialogue between the secular and the religious. And it is this dialogical space where the spiritual sensibilities in Muslim societies are able to incorporate a democratic ethos, which is my point of nonviolent Islam, because it also means the birth of an Islamic understanding of secular politics that has embraced the principles of human rights and democratic governance. So, what I am actually arguing here is that the post-Islamist reading of secularism would be a kind of a rethinking of the secular space from within the civil society, while incorporating the variable of the spiritual in the construction of the political. So I take you back to the beginning of my talk when I said that Gandhi talks about the spiritualization of politics against fundamentalism, against ideologization of religion, against different forms of organized religion, or let's say theocratic politics. But closer to our debate, I think it also means to rethink the challenge of democracy in the Muslim world, since we are at the Kennedy School, and beyond what I called in my book the clash of intolerances, and in the context of rethinking nonviolent potentials of Muslim political experiences. So here, what we have is a kind of a shift from belligerent citizenship to a kind of a dialogical citizenship in the Muslim world, which can certainly affect the political construction of the Muslim public space, because this is the scope of our thought and the scope of our action. And related to this idea, of course, is a critical re-evaluation of Islamic history in the nonviolent process of recognition of others. I think that a nonviolent Islam requires Muslims to develop, certainly, a new category beyond the categories that we already have in the Muslim world. As you know, there are, especially in the language of those who have a hard reading of the Quran and a hard reading of Islam, there is this separation between Darul Harb and Darul Islam, the abode of Islam and actually the land of, I would say, the abode of those infidels and those who do not belong to Islam, which is the abode of war. Now, I certainly think that we can introduce a third category, which is Darul Sabr, which means the land of patience. The same patience, the same word which Abdul Ghaffar Khan is talking about, the abode of patience, which is much more contractual, much more dialogical, and much more peaceful in its to get out of this kind of a dialectic. And it also brings the idea of sharing moral togetherness in a nonviolent Islamic context. And I think it also talks about the sharing of an ethical territory, which is relates us to the human rights and the promotion of human rights. So what is at stake here is neither a theologization of politics nor an absolute secularization of the Muslim public sphere. The real issue is actually to find a third way between the secular authoritarianism and Muslim fundamentalism, and in this third way would certainly be this minimal spiritual ethos, which is intervenes like a non-violence, I would say, in the public sphere. And if we understand democracy as a process and not as an ideal, then I would say that the tactics of getting to this ideal are themselves part of the democratic process in the Muslim public sphere and not independent of it. And so this demands certainly a new shift in Muslim historical consciousness in order to trace nonviolence as an operating principle of shared political morality in the Muslim public sphere. So in establishing nonviolent values, Muslims are ethically obliged to re-establish ways of opening to others instead of demonizing them, while recognizing the primacy of the human rights, universal human rights, over cultural and religious particularisms. And if the world is seeking a way out of this clash of intolerances, the best way is certainly to listen to others and to have and nurture and develop these dimensions of human dignity. I think that's the most important. So here, I think the idea which I've been working practically in the past 15 years of my life, which is cross-cultural learning and dialogue among cultures, here I think that cross-cultural learning certainly is very important to nonviolent thinking. If we want to think about nonviolence in Islam or in other religions, and especially since I was talking about Islam here and nonviolent Gandhis in Islam, I think that cross-cultural learning would be a very important aspect. And it does not simply mean or aim at bridging the gaps between the huge aggregates of cultures expressed in such entities as the East and West, but it aims to bridge gaps where there is a strong sense of us and them, which emerges across boundaries. And this is where I think we should insist on human rights, universal human rights, as the moral minimum, as the moral capacity of humankind to protect the necessary conditions for this human dignity. Now, of course, Muslims, I think, have a duty to promote human rights if they want to go towards nonviolence for three related reasons. The first reason is that the principle of equal human worth enjoins a duty to promote human well-being within the limits of our capacity. The second reason is that the principle of human rights encourages diversity and plurality of views, and that's very important. And the third reason is, as I said earlier, in our increasingly independent world, religious fundamentalism and ethnic sectarianism affect the moral and political interests of all. And it's important to have a kind of a global ethics, which I think could be nonviolence and human rights. Now, to end, I think that in addition to that, as I said, cross-cultural learning, cross-cultural dialogue brings me back again to Gandhi. And since we were talking about Gandhi, as you know, Gandhi said that he didn't want his house to be walled on all sides and his windows to be stuffed because he wanted the cultures of all lands to be blown about his house as freely as possible. I think this is a huge message for cross-cultural learning, and what a challenge I think these words have today for us who are struggling against the clash of intolerances in our world, but especially for those who are Muslims or are fighting in the Muslim world. If the Muslim world somehow is seeking a way out of its violence, the best way is certainly to look back to the dialogue building message of these Muslim Gandhis. That's for sure. But in order to have future Muslim Gandhis, because this was a question which was asked by me, Muslims need to be the driving forces of peace and nonviolence themselves, and to be the change, as Gandhi said, that they want to see in the world. And because today the main question is not to renounce to one's beliefs, but to change the violent way through which one announces them, I do believe that, this is my last word, I think that the question today, if we want to answer the question if there is another Gandhi possible today or not, the question is no more to ask if we believe or we don't believe, but the question is to ask what we can do with our belief. Thank you very much.
Before we entertain questions, let me thank the Center for Middle Eastern Studies and the Middle East Initiative of the JFK School of the Kennedy School for co-sponsoring this event today, and point out that this is Rory Stewart's last day officially at the Carr Center and the Kennedy School. And so we're going to give him the privilege of the first question.
So, Professor Jahanbegloo, firstly, my apologies, because it's my last day, I can't stay as
Yes.
director.
Okay, thank you for coming.
How does this relate to what happens inside the West, inside the United States and Europe? Because sometimes maybe human rights in an American or European context becomes just a sort of formal legal framework, which doesn't have any great ethical or spiritual dimension. It isn't justified really in ethical or spiritual terms, or maybe in very thin terms, oh, if we have human rights, then you're safer or you're a bit happier. So to what extent do you think this basic Gandhian project of putting the ethical and the spiritual in is something that is important in terms of future of human rights in Europe and the United States?
Well, I would say that the first thing is that it would be wrong to argue that human rights is only a Western idea. That's already a good start. And secondly, what I was trying to point at was that if we take human rights more than just let's say, a judicial framework, if we take it as a moral capacity, if we think of it in terms of a moral capital, the idea of moral capital like social capital, like human capital, if we think of it as a moral capital for our world today, I think that it would be necessary for the rule of law and the necessary condition for the human dignity beyond all forms of policy making. I think it's at that level that we should think of human rights, which we usually don't do, not as an accomplished phenomenon, but which belongs to our past, which belongs to 60 years ago, or goes back to the French Revolution for the first time, or Magna Carta, but as an option for our plural future. So in that sense, I would think that there would be no distinction between the Western policymaking or the Eastern, let's say, Muslim or Buddhist or Hindu policymakings around the world, because if we think in terms of the plural future and the global world, and if we think of human rights in terms of moral capital, we always need to go back to this moral minimum to bring the spirituality and ethics into politics and to policymaking. And that would be a very important issue. One of the problems with human rights promotion in today's world is that it's just taken as a bureaucratic framework, but by many people who are working in bureaucratic institutions, and they think that if they take it from one place to another, they can just frame it in those societies and just invite people to practice it. But this is not actually the case. What I'm trying to suggest is that we ask new questions about human rights. We ask new questions about the modalities of practicing human rights or promoting human rights in today's world. And that would be somehow to go deep into the cultures of people and try to show them that, well, they can find elements in their civilizational encounters, they can find elements of these human rights or this moral minimum in themselves, in their own cultures. I'll give you an example, and that's very closely related. Sorry to be so long for the question, but it's a very interesting question. I give an example on Iran and nonviolence. I've been working on that, especially for the civic movement. And one of the points which is always coming up, especially by the Iranian government, because they're looking always for conspirators and conspiracy all over the world, they always relate nonviolence to, and the reading of Iranians of nonviolence and the practice of nonviolence by the Iranian civic movement to Gene Sharp and to the ideas which are coming from the White House. Now, as long as they do that, everybody is a conspirator. But if you go with another counter-argument by saying, why do we need Gene Sharp? I mean, okay, reading Gene Sharp is a good thing, but every culture, like in Hinduism, in Iran we have had in the past 3,000 years elements like in Zoroaster and in the post-Islamic period of the mystics. We have elements of nonviolence. Iranians have been practicing that in their culture as much as they don't need to go and just push the doorbell at the White House and say what kind of recipe you have for us if we want to engage in it. So this is one of the points, and it's the same with human rights. If human rights is rejected by those who believe in a fundamentalist Islam or theologization of politics, it's mainly because they think it as an intruder. What my suggestion is that it's not an intruder, actually, because what human rights is promoting nonviolence, isn't it? And nonviolence has never been discussed as an intrusion in anybody's culture. I hope I answered your question. Yes.
Hi, this was a great lecture. And I have a question about whether another way to frame what you're saying is to think about this in terms of trust.
Yes,
the reason
yes.
I say that is because if you think about people who are thinking about religion, trust is an element of putting your trust or faith in God. And you were talking about sort of the pendulum swung towards secularism in the Middle East in Turkey, under the Ba'ath Party, there's other examples, and now it's sort of swinging to the other side, and that really whether people can embrace nonviolence is about whether they have faith in the process, and that ultimately is building trust.
Wonderful question, actually, because I think that the whole problem is that we have lost our trust. I mean, cultures, and especially the Muslim world and the Western world, they have lost their mutual trust. You know, trust is like a vase. I think once it's broken, as we say, it's very difficult to fix it, and it's not the same vase. So you have to look for another vase and for a new trust. And I think that without trust, and this is what has happened to the human rights today, without trust, words will become like the hollow sound of, I would say, a wooden gong. And but with trust, I think that the words become life itself. So we do need to create new forms of trust. And of course, nonviolence, I do believe in it firmly. I do believe that nonviolence is a potent weapon, actually, to achieve this trust, because it is a potent weapon to achieve justice and to moral goods. And certainly, it's also an education of the spiritual friendship, which is very important. Because we do talk about friendship all the time, and friendship among nations, but this friendship is needed to be deeply spiritual, not religious, deeply spiritual. And the aim of it is that trust that you're talking about, meaning that people, they think that when let's say, United States of America is talking about human rights, they are not thinking intervention behind it, you know? So there is no trust. But if they come and say, well, we want to promote human rights, they mean culture of nonviolence, of course. Yes. Yes, yes.
Yeah, I enjoyed your talk very much.
Thank you very much.
Hopeful. I approve your project. But I heard several assumptions from you, and I'll just pick a couple of examples that I don't think are obvious and that I don't even necessarily agree with. So if I misunderstood, you'll tell me. Or,
Yes.
Okay. So first, you seem to assume that the Islamic tradition is particularly violent. Now, I'm not a historian of religion, but I know with religions that I know best, let's say Judaism and Christianity, have been historically extremely violent. I mean, Judaism both pre-diaspora and post-diaspora, and Christianity throughout its hegemonic role. You seem to assume that, or you stated actually, that spiritual values come from religion, whereas I would argue the opposite. I would argue that there's an ethical bedrock that all religions refer to, and that is somewhat cross-cultural in its content. And I mean, as one example, Confucianism is not a religion, but it is a very highly developed ethical code. A third one would be the relationship between democracy and nonviolence. You seem to assume that democracy is a hospitable environment for nonviolence. My experience is quite the opposite. So I wonder if you could address some of those.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you on the spiritual bedrock. I was actually talking about that. I mean, what I meant was not that, certainly not that Islam is a religion of violence, and now we have to look for nonviolent Islam. What I said was that there were elements of nonviolence in Islam which were ignored, And when we start writing the history of Islam, or we look at Muslims, the first thing which comes up is either the headscarf, or which becomes a problem for Mr. Sarkozy or others in Europe, or we think of them as terrorists or fundamentalists. Now, practically nobody goes and has a reading of not only Islam, but also in Hinduism and others, of these Muslim Gandhis or are people who have non-violent. I mean, tell me how many people in Christianity know Thomas Merton, who refer to Thomas Merton in the 20th century. They will certainly go and look towards Vatican more than looking towards Thomas Merton, and have readings of people like Thomas Merton, or the Quakers or others. So that's a very important point. What I was trying to say is that, first of all, I do distinguish between spirituality and religion. I do believe that religion can have forms of organized dogmatism, which necessarily spirituality is not having. And spirituality is, you can find it in arts as much as in philosophy and as much in religion, because it's a search for meaning in life. And so you can base a civic humanism, as we have done in the West, on forms of spirituality, which is very important. Secondly, I think that the point is to how we could remove these, let's say, landmines of hatred and violence from our hearts and minds in different religions, and how we can overcome it. Now, these landmines are already there in our democratic discourse also. They're already there in what I was telling Rory, in the discourse of human rights, and that's why people don't trust it. Now, I think the best approach would be to go beyond this dialectic of us and them, which is very, very important, and to redefine, certainly, democracy in the line of this cross-cultural learning. Let me say that since we are here at the Kennedy School and at Harvard, it's very important to say it here. There are 3 L's, which is listening, learning, and leading. And most of the time with political scientists and policymakers, you have the 3rd L, which comes before the 2 others. Instead of listening and learning, they want to lead. Now, there cannot be necessarily pragmatic leaders in today's world, or people who can achieve what they want to achieve, if they don't listen to others and they try to learn from others. The most successful, I would say, leaders, political leaders, even in this country, people like Lincoln and others, I would say, were people who wanted to listen to others and not just to talk and to lead them. So this idea of cross-cultural learning, I think, is immense, of immense importance to politicians. And it cannot be done. I mean, not only in the Muslim world, of course, very much so in the Muslim world, because it's a world in crisis, and political crisis especially. We need to bring into new paradigms in this world, and we need to bring in new paradigms in its civic movements. We need to go beyond, I would say, the lack of passion and apathies that you can find in Middle Eastern societies, which somehow divide them between military rule and forms of religious fundamentalism, and which scares me a lot, because when you go and talk about people's destinies, you see that some of them are not interested at all in what's going to happen in their future. And but it's also important to somehow lift the shadow of violence, I would say, from the Islamic mind. And that's very important. And one of the ways of doing it, of course, we have to do it pragmatically through the civic movements, as I said, and through bringing in dialogue between the secular and the religious. But one of the ways is also to show that there has been elements of non-violence in Islam as much as in other religions and religious people, and they can help. And if we go back to these paradigms. Yes, we'll start with the lady there.
Well, I'm really happy that I really enjoyed your lecture, and also I'm happy to have a question posed, because it's depressing and kind of disheartening how often that question arises, and people say, why is there no Muslim Gandhi? You know, and I mean, it seems like in addition to everything that you're saying, on a practical level, in the most repressive contexts, in Palestine or in other very repressive contexts, that person is in jail or that person has been killed. And it seems to be a testament to the potency of nonviolence that it's something that can be that will get so actively suppressed. Yes. And so I wonder, in that, obviously this is something you know too well and you know on, and I just wonder if you could speak to, in that context, the fact that, unfortunately that leaves violence as something that maybe requires less organizing, it gains more headlines, it's perhaps more celebrated, and that it's in that very repressive kind of environment that you see the relative ease of violence as compared to an organized, sustained, nonviolent movement.
Yes, I think you're quite right. I mean, the media around the world, they have a tendency to talk more about violence and violent people rather than non-violent people, and they become suddenly mesmerized if they see Gandhi's or Luther King's coming up or Mandela's. But if in the absence of Mandela's, Gandhi's, and Martin Luther King's, there is silence. There is silence. Yet, I think that the real experience of politics is done in a nonviolent way around the globe. Actually, I think that the work which is done by the NGOs, the work which is done by the civil society activists, by what we call the global civil society is a nonviolent work. The work which is done today for ecology, for the environment, the work which is done for poverty, against prostitution, against drug addiction, in countries like India, in South America, and elsewhere, these are not necessarily ideological, movements. These are not movements like in 60 years ago they wanted to have a dictatorship of proletariat, or they wanted to have a communist regime or a social. These are, I think that these are movements which are deeply nonviolent, and they are movements which are bringing in a new ethics into politics. Ethics which is not, unfortunately, practiced by many politicians around the world. And that's why we have so many problems. And we have to understand that the economic crisis and the problems that we have is actually the problems of absence of trust, but absence of ethics, the fact that there is no moral capital, there is no reference to this moral capital. And I do believe that it is very important. And so we have to, the real winners of the Nobel Peace Prize, I think, should be civil society activists more than politicians. Because it's the future of the world is done by them more than anybody. Of course, they die, they are killed, they go to prison. But I think that they leave us with, and sometimes they succeed, like Mandela and Gandhi and Martin Luther King. They succeed to stay, and when they succeed, they remain for centuries. But it's very important to have their message. It's a very important message. I think, to tell you the truth, once again, because we're at the Kennedy School, I do believe, what is America in the 20th century without Martin Luther King? I don't think that you can talk about the future of America. Obama would not have been there without Martin Luther King, that's for sure. Actually, this is one of the questions I give to my, at the final exam, to my students. Between, the relationship between Obama and his presidency and the civil rights movement in America. So, what is the new South Africa without Mandela? I mean, we're going to have the soccer game, World Cup, and without somebody like Mandela and efforts that him and others in the nonviolent movement had, we could not have in the apartheid regime a soccer World Cup. I mean, that's for sure. So I do believe that the moral capital is there. But what I was suggesting, what I was talking about, is that if we are talking about the promotion of human rights, we have to go back to this moral capital and use it as an effective and pragmatic, actually, forms of policymaking, instead of just leaving it to history books and thinking of it in terms of just past history. Yes?
Thank you so much for this excellent talk. If we take your concept that the Muslim Gandhi has to come from the Muslim world,
Yes.
and if if in fact there have been these Muslim Gandhis in the past, what would be wonderful, I mean, you said, you ended your talk with, ask what we can do.
Mhm.
So it seems to me that one wonderful thing that we could do would be to tell those stories. There's a book and a wonderful public television show called The Force More Powerful, which tells the story of Gandhi and Martin Luther King and others. And it would be wonderful to tell the Muslim Gandhi stories. And I wonder if you have a short Muslim Gandhi story you could tell us, it would give us a feeling of hopefulness.
Mm-hmm. Well, I myself, thank you so much for your kind words. I myself have written many essays which have been published in different journals, but I have a book which is called The Spirit of India, published by the Penguin. And in that book there are 2 essays on Gandhi, and there are one on Maulana Azam, one on Abdul Ghaffar Khan. Actually, one of the essays is called Is a Muslim Gandhi Possible? Which is not exactly the speech I gave, the talk I gave today. But I mean, the talk, a little bit the talk which I gave today was similar to a talk which I gave in Turkey, because I go around the Muslim world and try to challenge actually people in the Muslim world. And that was published by the Philosophy and Social Criticism journal, volume 36, and which just got out. So yes, I think so. And a Canadian, I think it's actually, this lady is related to Marshall McLuhan. She just finished a documentary on Abdul Ghaffar Khan, which just came out and was shown at the Toronto Film Festival. But it's, they haven't shown it on TV yet. And it's a very important document, actually, the only document. And you know, the interesting point about Abdul Ghaffar Khan is that he was alive until 1988. And in post-independence, since he lived there, he was a Pashtun, and it's even more important that he was a Pashtun, because we have all these crises in Afghanistan today. And it shows that there can be nonviolence in Afghanistan, because he was organizing all these red shirts, not the same that we have today in Thailand, but these red shirts, the Khudai Khidmatkar, who around 10,000, 20,000 of them actually were non-violent. He called them non-violent soldiers of non-violence. And later on, when the Pakistan was created, he again, despite the fact that he spent 30 years of his life in British prisons, again he went to prison. Because he was fighting against a regime who did not admit and accept, which did not admit and accept nonviolence. So this man was alive until 1988, and that makes him a Muslim Gandhi, which has been interviewed on film, and we have documentaries on him, which is very, very important. But there are many others, I think, around the world which we need to recognize. I mean, traveling and meeting these people is very important, and especially in places where especially Westerners don't go, because we have a prejudice about it, or we have a feeling that, well, it's too much violence. Like Kashmir, for example. I did go and talk at the Srinagar University. I gave 2 lectures on Islam and nonviolence, and it was quite challenging, because it's, you know, it's like going to Gaza or Palestine and talking about the same subject. It becomes very important. Yes.
So thank you very much for this very interesting talk. When you say Muslim Gandhi possible, I hear 2 things. One is a person with those thoughts, and the other is a person who actually succeeds.
Yes.
And so, which is it? Because this other person, you mentioned, he obviously didn't succeed in any project in particular. And the examples you gave, Mandela, Luther King, these are successful people. So is a question then, are people with these thoughts possible as leaders, or question, perhaps more important question, can they succeed like these archetypes that you have mentioned?
Well, I mean, this is of course a very important question. As I said in the beginning of my talk, I think the starting point for a better world is the belief that it's possible. And all these people did believe that it was possible. I think that Abdul Ghaffar Khan did succeed because he was fighting for independent India, and Maulana Azad also, and they succeeded in ending up with the colonialism, but they also succeeded in making the new India. Of course, the new India is not necessarily non-violent India or the Gandhi's ideal of India, but I think that we cannot separate necessarily, especially South Asia. Now, this is a point I didn't mention, which I usually mention in the Middle East. I do believe that if we have one of the issues that we have today in Iran, in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Syria, not that much in Saudi Arabia and UAE because there are not too many debates in those countries at this level. But it's as you know, because you're Iranian also, it's a debate between the secular and the religious. Okay, when either you're going toward, like in Egypt, either you're going towards Ikhwan al-Muslimin and people of Muslim Brotherhood, or you're getting out of the theologization of politics like in Iran, how could you find a dialogue between the two? Now, most of the time, and that has been the case for both of us in the past, most of the time, the models, the paradigms have been, like in the case of Reza Shah and Ataturk and others, has been, let's secularize the country and exclude the religious completely. Many Iranians believe that in today's Iran. The Turks, they have this debate, hugely actually, with the AKP. Now, I do believe that instead of bringing the paradigms from the West, we can bring them from South Asia. What I'm suggesting, which I did in another lecture, and I published it in Italy and Spain, which is called the two concepts of secularism, is that we do not necessarily need to turn towards the French laïcité, which causes enormous issues and problems for the French society itself, with its 5 million Muslims, and the Burqa problem. So we don't need to imitate a model which is not working for that society itself, but if we need to have models, why don't we go towards the South Asian experience of Islam, which might be a difficult experience, but it is nevertheless working at the level of diversity. Because many of these South Asian countries, they have Muslim minorities, and Muslim minorities, they might be poorer minorities, they might have some problems, but there is one thing which is important. They have full participation in the policy making of those countries. Like in India, they can become prime ministers or the presidents, you know. So in a country with a Hindu majority, okay. So that's very important. So when I said equal respect for all religions, that's the definition that people like Nehru and Gandhi and Maulana Azad were giving of secularism, and it's inscribed in the Indian constitution, with all these problems and debates that we have in India today. So Muslim Gandhis are possible if we think of them in today's debate between secularism and the religious, which is actually the huge debate today for the future of the Middle East, especially, because we have to get out of that dilemma somehow. Other than
thank you so much. Sorry, you had a class all that.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
Thanks. No, I think my question relates a little bit more to your own background and the fact that you returned to Iran and you from what I remember tried to work with the youth and bring in some of the lessons that you have learned from your studies. And I'm just really curious to know how much you think facilitating this kind of education where if you don't, for instance in Iran, right, if you don't feel like you're getting enough information about, let's say, nonviolence, ways of resisting without violence from your environment, from the government, from schools, universities, I think, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel as a modern youth, in Tehran, you might actually look at some of the Western literature, some of the Western thoughts, just because that has been abandoned from you so much that you might feel that that's just where you can find it. And so how much do you think it's actually, based on your experience, how important was it to feed the youth with the kinds of nonviolence that exist in the Muslim world that they probably don't know, even though they are part of the Muslim world about it?
Yes, well, thank you for this question. I think that it's not a question to preach nonviolence, you know, it's a question of practicing nonviolence. And the best way of practicing nonviolence, I would say, as it has always been done, is to engage in some kind of a civic dialogue with the others. Now, I studied in the West. I did work on the West, on Western philosophy. I did write on the West. But I thought, in the same way as Gandhi did actually, and many others, I always thought that there is no separation, as Kipling says, between East and West, and the two cannot meet, shall not meet. I think that the two were always there, because, and the experience of many people, like MLK, Martin Luther King, going to India and finding Gandhi, but of course before going to India he already knew about Gandhi through his professors here in Boston and elsewhere, and others who, and Gandhi learning about Tolstoy and corresponding with him. I think that this cross-cultural learning is very important. Now, if you take the message, and that's why once, since you're talking on a personal level about my life, once I got into Iran, I started inviting people like Habermas and Gorty, and but also people from India and the Arab world, and also from Eastern Europe, because I thought that their experience, like Michnik and Agnes Heller, because I thought that their experience would be very interesting for the civil society and especially the youth in Iran, and I was not wrong, because it was very important. So, you know, my philosophy is this philosophy, this Eastern philosophy of the story of the blind men who are describing an elephant in a dark room, and each one describes it in a different. This is a Hindu, Persian, Turkish, Arab story, you know, we share, everybody in the East shares this story. But the important, the morality, I would say, of this story is that though they describe the elephant in different manners, one's describing it as a pillar, and another one describing it as a snake, is that there can be, when we want to talk about the elephant itself in its totality, there has to be a dialogue between those people in the room. They have to listen to each other, and once again to learn from each other, and have a kind of a safe crossing through the river of cultures. And that, I think, is the most important message, which is important in nonviolence. Because if nonviolence in the promotion of human rights becomes one of the pillars of the policymaking in our world, it permits people to trust each other, but also permits them to learn from each other, which is very important, very, very important. I mean, there's no way you can just go somewhere and say, we are bringing you our democracy and this is the best way of life, and you just take it from there. Well, these people, they have a past, they have a civilization, they have a culture. What does it mean? I mean, they have to go on with their culture and try to live with their culture. So, and vice versa. I mean, I think that and I wrote it in my book on the Clash of Intolerances, if you talk about a civilization which closes itself to other cultures, the world civilization is no more there. Because by definition, by meaning, a civilization is actually a process. It's always in the process of making itself. So you cannot stop it somewhere and say, we are a civilization, we are a dark room and we don't want to get out of it, and this is what we have. That's it. No, it doesn't work. Actually, civilization is, I would say, the best definition of civilization is inter-civilization. It's an inter-civilizational dialogue. That's what makes human civilization. And that's why I started by saying, where religions are supposed to be elements which add to civilizations and to this civilizational process, not to stop it and to go against human dignity. Yes?
I thank you very much for the lecture, and I love I'm an anthropologist, and my background is just, studying culture.
Mm-hmm.
I understand violence comes when there are clashes of cultures, and in your case, if we give you the whole power culture of Islam, especially the treatment of women
Mhm.
and human rights and right of women, especially women and ethnic minorities, etc., etc. Obviously, what I see in Iran is, based on my research, is the clash of two cultures. The culture that was there, Zoroastrian, good deed, we say, in action, and actually good thinking, is clashing with do's and don'ts of every moment of your life.
Yes.
From the beginning of your,
Mhm.
even when a child is conceived, is a girl, is treated differently, and even in math. So how do you reconcile? Suppose there is this, you are Gandhi of Islam. How do you reconcile those Islamic laws with the new 21st century citizens and human rights?
Yes, this is a very important question, which I try to answer in my book, The Clash of Intolerances. The first thing which I can say is that cultures do not clash, human beings do. And who are those who clash with each other? Sorry?
I said interesting.
Yes, interest class, yes, is intolerant people. I mean, you have intolerant human beings in different cultures which clash with each
I
other.
don't agree with you. And
It's-
this one is passive, then there is no violence.
No. It's just that well, we have to understand that intolerant people or human beings are products of intolerant societies, but intolerant societies are not fate of those societies, are not destinies of those societies. So intolerant societies can change into tolerant societies, and it has been the case. We have had the Inquisition in Christianity, and we don't have it anymore today. Okay, why? Because we turn towards democratic experiences. We turn towards the women's rights. We turn towards gay and lesbian rights in the 20th century. The vote of women. So it shows that we are in permanent struggle for nonviolence, I would say, against, and understand by nonviolence the taming of violence in our societies. That's very important, because some people have a tendency to say, I cannot be a Gandhi, so what the hell? I would say, no, it's not a question of you being a Gandhi or not being a Gandhi, or being a Martin Luther King or not being, but how much do you fight against intolerance in the framework of your personal and collective life? Which way, for example, if we are professors at the university, or we are students at the university, how can you bring this idea and this ideal to your students or bring it to your colleagues? That's what I try to do. I mean, I try to change my way of teaching my students. I try to change the ways they can teach me, and we have this mutual dialogue. So I do believe that the true opposition is not the individual versus cultures. Actually, the true opposition is somehow the clash of intolerances inside different cultures. And why do we have this intolerance? Because we have absolutists. We have pluralists, but we have absolutists. Now, with the laws you were talking about in Islam, is not necessarily practiced by everybody, and many people who have what I call, quote-unquote, soft reading of Islam, they don't get to hard universalisms. Because they believe human rights, one of the issues with human rights when it's practiced by hard universalists is because it becomes a hard universalism itself. And when you're an interventionist and you think of human rights in a framework that you can put it with a military option, it's a hard form of universalism. And because it's a framework which does not pay attention to the cultural diversities and cultural particularisms of different
call
cultures.
that Muslim Gandhi. We can say that humanistic Gandhi.
No, Gandhi.
Because Muslim Gandhi should leave the Islamic laws at the door when he comes in, because all those laws bring injustice, and injustice creates violence.
No, I think that Muslim Gandhis are possible as much as Hindu or Buddhist Gandhis, because culture is what gives the human beings the capacity, the crucial capacity to ask questions of themselves about their own culture. So it's very important to understand that when I'm saying Muslim Gandhis, meaning Muslims who are asking questions about Islam. And when they bring into nonviolence, they are actually asking questions, as Gandhi did. For example, Gandhi himself, his critique of organized religion, his critique of Hindu fanaticism, his critique, of course he did not criticize many points, but he did also criticize many points, and that's why he was assassinated.
So what do we call that Gandhi of the East, Gandhi of the Middle East, rather than Muslim Gandhi?
Because I'm a Muslim, I'm concerned with Islam, you know?
Those two terms.
I'm concerned with Islam as a Muslim, as somebody who was born in the Muslim context, in the Islamic context. So, and because we have a lot of crisis in the Islamic context.
Those two are mutually exclusive, Muslim and.
No, they are not exclusive at all. Like in other cultures, they are not exclusive. Yes.
Agree that you are Muslim and apply all Islam.
My question is with respect to the current level of arms that are available in society in a lot of Middle East. So can
What? Arms?
Arms, yes.
Weapons, yes.
Weapons, yes. So is a Gandhi possible in the context of the amount of weapons that exist in society today compared to what existed when Gandhi was around?
Of course, yes. I mean, it has nothing to do with only arms. I mean, it's, as I said, it's not, if you remember at the end of my talk, I said it's the question in a very Shakespearean way. It's not to believe or not to believe, but it's what you do with your belief. So the question is that how you practice your nonviolence, and it's not just coming and preaching about human rights and nonviolence. That's not useful at all. I would say how you practice it. And I think that our options about armaments and weapons of mass destruction also are as important as our options today for the future of the biosphere and the environment. I mean, this is a question of awareness and consciousness that we need to have because we're thinking about the future of humanity. I mean, I don't see how people can be passive and say, well, I'm not interested. Well, how can human beings, because we are cultural beings, okay? So, but cultures are not monolithic frameworks, you know, they always change. So if we do not believe in cultures as monolithic frameworks, we do accept the fact that we can change cultures, and we do change with cultures. So if we have this attitude, this option, nonviolence specifically, about our role and the fact that if we want to have a future, we need to turn towards these ideals, but also to these practices, not just ideals, practices. I think that non-proliferation is also one of them, actually, as much important as the global, yes.
Maybe I can follow up on that, because I think what you're saying is that we need to broaden our conception of violence as well. I worked in Latin America once, and a president there asked me, he said, you know, you gringos have strange conceptions of violence and nonviolence. You're worried about what's done with machete and machine gun, but what about watching your child die slowly of hunger, or what about not being able to take your child to a doctor when they're, you know, that's a violence to the spirit, that if you don't grasp that, you'll never understand nonviolence. And I think that
yes, and the violence, thank you, Charlie, and I think that violence is not something isolated from other issues. I mean, prostitution is a form of violence. Poverty is a form of violence, which has always been forwarded by people like Martin Luther King. Why did Martin Luther King fight against Vietnam War and against poverty in America? And he did not separate it from the civil rights movement because he thought that these issues are not separated. For Gandhi also, what he calls his community work, his Sarvodaya, is also related very closely to Satyagraha, to his fight for independence and Swaraj. These points are not, I think that they are closely related. In today's world, one of the issues that we have, we can see it more in Europe than in North America, okay? It is the issue of cultural diversity, okay? And I do believe that we can, as we can see today in the Netherlands, in Denmark, in Germany, in France, the issue, if we don't have an intercultural dialogue, the problem of diversity is just a slogan there. I mean, how can European cultures come and say we are multicultural when they treat the Muslim population in the way they are doing it? And this is one of the ways.
That's the issue.
Yes, and if they, because they don't want, I mean, when I say they, I'm thinking mostly about the policymakers, but policymakers and media, they can influence people. But you can also find ways, alternative ways of bringing in the message. I was telling Stephen from the Carr-Ryan Center that one of the most important things in today's world is educating, actually, nonviolence and human rights, educating people. But educating is the best form of promotion, but educating is not doing it from outside and just sending messages like that, but also going and working with people on the field and trying to show that this is possible. And my point in most of my Spanish writings, actually, in Spain, is that Islam has always been part of Europe. It has been part of the Islamic culture, has been part of the European culture. So why do you exclude Islam from the European culture and you see it as the other, which is invading actually Europe? It's not at all the case. I mean, as you can see, flamenco is actually, as a form of music, it was basically coming from the East also partly. Same thing with the diversity in India. I mean, I think that the Indians, they have this awareness of understanding that they had a emperor like Ashoka, but also they had people like Akbar, and they know that they have Persians like Amir Khosrow and others who came from Iran, and they brought them new things about Persian mysticism and even the way they eat their Mughali food. So I think that this intermixing is very, very important for our world. Yes. Yes.
I was just wondering whether the timeline historically, it seems that the current historical context is much more complex and confusing than either the time period when Martin Luther King Jr. was active, and the time period when, and the situation when Gandhi was doing his protest movement. I mean, it just seems as if the issues are confusing. It's much more difficult to enunciate the grievances that people have in terms that can be publicly understood. There's sort of an erosion of the public space, partly because of this television business.
Yes.
You know, because on television, half of it is news, and half of it is fiction, and sometimes you're never really sure which is which. So that the public space itself is kind of you know, you aren't really sure what's true. Do you understand? I mean,
I do understand.
And war is diplomacy. Is the result of the failure of diplomacy. Violence is the result of the failure of civil society and politics. And when people can't express their grievances because there's so much propaganda and confusion around, then you have these things happening.
Yes, I do understand what you're saying, though I believe that we are not totally in the brave new world, as Aldous Huxley used to say. I do believe that some of the parameters have changed, certainly have changed, and it's with the communication technologies, things have become very different. Even for the civic movements, like you see it in Iran today, how they use the Twitter and the YouTube instead of sending tapes like Ayatollah Khomeini used to do from 30 years ago, or writing letters and in the constitutional revolution of 1906, 1911. But I do think also that some parameters, some paradigms, I would say, that we have in our different cultures and in human civilization in general, in the global civilization, they have not changed. I think that some ideals are still the same. We still do talk about liberty. We do still talk about justice. We do still talk about violence and non-violence. It makes sense for us. They are meaningful. And we do still go and die for our flags. And we do still have both negative and positive views of, I would say, nationalist interests and ethnic interests. So all these issues are very meaningful, and I think it helps us for our democratic participation in the future, but we certainly need, once again, I'll come back to this idea of education, and we do need new ways of educating masses. And this, it's not that I just think that the elite should do that. I think that the masses can educate themselves. The best way to do it is through civic movements. Because every time they have done that, and they get engaged, and they become responsible, and the idea of responsibility is the most important. How people become responsible, and they want to do something about that. What happened in South Africa with Mandela and the ANC against apartheid was very interesting. I mean, it went through times, of course. But you have it also, look in Thailand, look in Burma, look in Iran, practically everywhere where you have civic debates, you have public sphere debates. People are not passive. I mean, they engage themselves because they're interested, because they think that it's part of their future and it's part of their destiny. So we do need, I don't know if everybody here is a participant in the public sphere, or American, or let's say global one, but I think that we need to find networks to do that. That's why I did talk about the NGOs. I think that the NGOs, one of the places where it's happening, NGOs around the world, they have created these networks for public debate and changes in public sphere, and for awareness also. I mean, it's very important to give voices to those who are voiceless. But who gives this voice to the voiceless people in Latin America, in Asia, in the Arab world, in Australia, everywhere? Who gives this? Because these people, a peasant in Paraguay might not have the voice to become, but I think that through these organizations, they can find this voice. And it's very important to understand that as our moral capital. Yes?
So my question is about one contradiction that I see with respect to what we have discussed in our class on religious politics and policy. One of the verses from Prophet is that if you see something wrong, probably non-Islamic, you first correct it with your hand, then with your tongue, and then probably with your heart. So how does that reconcile with the idea of Gandhi, where non-violence is totally, in some ways, stacked in the opposite order?
It's not contradictory. I think that it's also a way of learning, as you said. It's a way of learning how to think with our hearts and minds at the same time, and not just with our prejudice. I mean, it is a way of learning. I mean, this is very, very important, I think, and this is what brings hope, actually. And let me say that I do believe that, I didn't talk about this, but I do believe that since I'm not talking in the air, I'm not, as once again, I'm not preaching things which cannot happen. I do believe that great sufferings, actually, as we have it around the world today, they can bring great hopes. But we can also understand that great hopes, that they can bring great compassions, because people who are hoping, they have compassions, and great compassions, they certainly bring nonviolent hearts. And once we have a nonviolent heart, we might have a nonviolent person, and once we have a nonviolent person, we might have a nonviolent community, and once we have a nonviolent community, we might have a nonviolent nation, and after that, I think that we can educate. If we have a nonviolent communities around the world, we can possibly have a world with less violence. So it's a matter of going from the micro to the macro level, okay, and not vice versa. I'm not saying that if you preach at the macro level, you can touch the micro level. No, certainly not. Nonviolence struggle has always been at the micro level, always. That's why I talk about the civic movements. Because civic movements is about people themselves. It's not just about leaders, it's not about preaching, it's not about messages coming from outside, it's about people working with themselves, among themselves, and the idea of solidarity becomes very, very important, which none of us did talk about today.
Let me thank Professor stimulating lecture. lecture, and clearly everyone's attention was held. I encourage you to go to his website. You can see some of his writings there. And we hope this will be the beginning of an engagement with you, not the end of it.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to the Middle East Initiative of the Kinney School and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies for co-sponsoring this event.
Thank you very much.